Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum class. I'm your English teacher Zia. I hope that you're doing well. I welcome you to English grade 6 video lessons. My dear learners, as you know, we are dealing with our SLOs of Unit 4, and today we are going to cover an SLO of reading and critical thinking competency. Now, let's get started by reading our students' learning outcome to see what we are supposed to do and how we can achieve it. So our SLO is very simple. It says, identify different points of view in stories or poems. Now, we are going to learn and then be able to identify points of view in stories and poems. And specifically in this chapter, as you know, we are dealing with the poem. So we will be seeing the point of view in a poem. Now, let's get started with our vertical linkage, which is linking our SLO with the previous grade. As you have already studied it, I want you to retain as much information as you can so that you are all ready and set. Now, it's time for you to brainstorm a little bit and think about the topic that we are going to discuss. It says, in which manner do people talk with each other and tell their stories? Now, think over this brainstorming question. We know that there is not one way of telling a story. There are multiple ways, and also in poems we see that there are different kind of narrative styles and different points of view. So think about it. Do people tell their stories, or do people write poems in just one style, in one point of view, or there are different points of view? Think about it, and then so we can move on forward with our topic, which is about point of views. Now, let's see what is a point of view when it comes to any narration, whether it's a story or it's a poem. So a point of view is how the writer has decided to share the story or poem with the reader. So it's the decision of the writer that how he or she is going to tell the story and in what style. Sometimes the story or poem is told from a specific character's perspective or point of view, multiple characters' perspectives, or a narration not attached to any character. So we have three different scenarios over here. One is telling a story from specific character's point of view, then of including all the different characters in a poem or a story, and also narration or a point of view where there is no attachment to any kind of character. So these are different points of view in a story. Now, point of view, it is very much clear, it's a perspective. It's the decision of the writer or the poet that how he or she is going to present their ideas, their writing in front of you, how they are going to tell the story to you, and in what manner and in what style. So this is all the concern of sharing with you this lesson of different points of view, which is our students' learning outcome, so that we can identify the different perspectives that the writers have used. Now, let's see why having different points of view and changing it with your text is important. So determining the point of view is important when analyzing literature, anything that is written, whether it's a poem or a short story, because it affects how the reader experiences all elements of the story or poem. So point of view is important to add an effect to the reader's experience. This is why different points of view are used by different writers and poets. Now let's see that how many points of view are there and how do they work with examples. So there are these types of point of views that you often see in your reading, whether you're reading a story or a poem. Number one is first person. Then we have second person and then third person. All these are point of views. Let's start with first person. The story or poem is told from the perspective of a character who experiences the details of the story or poem firsthand. Narrators use I in first person narration. So, in this type of first person narration or this first person point of view, you can see that the narrator who's narrating the story, who's telling the story, or who is writing the poem will use the word I often, because I is including the first person narrative. The character is experiencing and telling at the same time in the form of a poem or any kind of text. So this is our first person. You should remember it very clearly that first person includes the word I. Then we have our second point of view, which is second person. The story or poem is told in a way that implies the events of the plot are happening to the reader using you throughout the narrations. This type is not very common, but it exists, so we need to learn it. So, what we are going to understand is that all the events, the experiences that are happening, if the reader is reading it, he or she will feel that this is directly including me, because I is the first person who's narrating the story, who has first hand experiences of the events, and you is referring to me, the reader, who is reading or listening. Then let's move on to the third person, which is this story poem or poem is told with a narrator completely outside of the story or the poem. What do we understand? That when the narrator is not using the first person or the second person narration, and the narrator who is telling us a story or any poem is not included himself or herself in the story or the poem. The narration never uses I. The perspectives of this narration are limited and omniscient. Now, we get to know that in third person, it is very easy to identify that it is not the first person narrative or the second person narrative or point of view, because the word I and you are not used. Rather, the narrator who's telling you the story is not included. He is not the character, and he is only just telling you the story. And there are two types, which is number one, the limited, and then the omniscient. It means we have two kinds of third person point of views or narrations, limited and omniscient. We will look on it with examples. Now, after clarifying all these different types of point of views, let's get started with our first person. And we know that the first person is actually experiencing the first hand experiences. So, here is an example. I heard the monsters growl from somewhere in the woods. He was following me. I couldn't believe I had been rejected from my first choice university. So these are different kind of sentences. You can see that it is a first person narrative or a point of view because I is used. Then you can see that the subject, the narrator, is experiencing everything firsthand. Here again, you can see with this example, I couldn't believe I had been rejected from my first choice university. Again, this is a first person narrator, first person narrative or point of view, as you can say, because again, the narrator is himself or herself telling the experiences faced firsthand. So this is an example of first person point of view. Now, another one is he was following me. Now, me here also tells you that it is also a first person narrative. Moving on to our next type, which is second person narrative or point of view. Here is an example. You feel your heart race and the air around you seems to crystallize, but the only way forward is to move your feet. Now, my dear learners, think over it. What kind of point of view is this? Yes, this is a second person point of view because the word you is used over and again. You feel your heart race and the air around you seems to crystallize, but the only way forward is to move your feet. So, this is directly including the reader or the listener in the narration. So, this is the second person narrative. And then for the third person narrative, we know that it is divided into two parts, limited and omniscient. Let's see what they are and how do they differ from each other. So, perspectives of third person, number one is limited. The narrator is outside of the story or the poem, but follows one specific character throughout the story or poem. This perspective follows the events that happen to them and often share that character's thoughts. Now, this is called third person limited because the narrator is limited to one specific character. Now, the narrator does not know anything about other characters, what they are up to, what they are planning or plotting. Rather, the narrator is only concerned with that one specific character through which he or she is telling the story or the poem. Next one we have, which is opposite of limited, omniscient. We call it third person omniscient. The narrator is outside of the story or a poem and is all knowing. The narrator can explain all characters' thoughts and knows details about events in the story or a poem that may be unknown to the featured characters. Now, in this kind of narrative style, this point of view, the narrator knows everything. He knows the ending, he knows about every character's inner feelings, thoughts, and emotions and what they are up to. This is what we call third person omniscient, where the narrator is all knowing. Whereas in third person limited, you can see that the narrator is only knowing about, is only aware of one specific character, and the rest of the happenings of different other characters are not known to the narrator. And it slowly reveals as the story or the poem progresses. So this is the difference between these two. One is limited and one is all-knowing, which we call omniscient. Now let's look at some examples of limited third-person narrative. Sarah nervously adjusted her backpack as she entered the dimly lit museum. The air hung heavy with the scent of old artifacts. She squinted at the dusty display cases, searching for the ancient Egyptian exhibit her dad mentioned. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the hall. Sarah's heart pounded. What was that? So, as you can see over here, this is in the third person point of view, but the narrator is only telling us what the character is feeling and facing, and the rest of the things, the unknown, is also not described by the narrator. So this is a very limited point of view in which we call it a limited third person limited. Next one, we have an example of third person omniscient. Sarah nervously adjusted her backpack as she entered the dimly lit museum. The air hung heavy with the scent of old artifacts. She squinted at the dusty display cases, searching for the ancient Egyptian exhibit her dad mentioned. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the hall. Sarah's heart pounded and she says, "What was that?" And now, as the story progresses, you know that the character Sarah, the narrator will tell you that there was somebody on the other side which Sarah doesn't know. And this kind of narrative will be called third person omniscient, because all the other happenings and how things will turn out is not known by Sarah. Rather, it's only known by our narrator. So the character is not fully aware of who was there and what was happening. This is our third person omniscient. Now, here is a poem from the text of the lesson. You need to find out the point of view mentioned in the poem. Can you guess it? Pause the video, read it, and then come up with your answer. Good. Now, we know that it is a third person narrative or third person point of view. Now, you see whether it's a limited third person point of view or omniscient third person point of view. Now, this is up to you. You have to come up with your answer and find the correct answer in a fast way, in a quick manner, so that you are very much aware that how you can recognize the different kind of third person narratives. Now, after this, you are here with your classroom activity. You have to identify the point of view from the following given poem. See if it's a first person narrative, second person narrative, or third person, limited or omniscient. Now, here is your simulation link that you can play to learn more about different types of point of views. Moving on, this is your worksheet where you have to read a story and answer specific point of view related questions. Your homework is to choose your favorite poem and identify its point of view. And you have to mention whether if it's a third person narrative or point of view, whether it's limited or omniscient. These are all your resources mentioned, and they are available in the description of the video. You can clearly and easily access them and practice your lesson with all the different activities available in worksheet and skill sheet. My dear learners, thank you for listening. I hope that now you know very well that there are different points of view in story and poem, and in that you have first person, second person, and third person. And third person includes limited and omniscient. Now you can easily identify any point of view, whether you're reading any kind of text, it's a poem or a story. I hope we have achieved our students' learning outcome. Thank you so much. See you in the next video lesson. Allah Hafiz.